And on that point, Photoshop has been the industry standard for 40 years. And at any time, you could have probably convinced yourself that some new competitor or technology would upend Adobe's leadership. Right? Like, I don't want to sound like somebody who doesn't understand the innovator's dilemma and how companies can be disrupted, because that does happen. I mean, in reality here, we're talking about a very long runway of dominance, and they've only continued to invest in making the service more powerful and just compounding their advantages, further entrenching Photoshop's position, for example, as the industry choice for image editing software.
Hey guys, today my co-host Shawn is back with another company pitch. And if you've ever downloaded a PDF file, enjoyed a film, skipped past an advertisement, or consumed, well, just about any type of media, you've almost certainly, either knowingly or unknowingly, interacted with something that was made using one of Adobe's myriad services. Founded in the early 1980s with the chief aim of addressing formatting issues when printing, the company has since become a vital part of many of our daily lives, though we might not always notice it. As is true for any great Silicon Valley story, Adobe began with two people in a garage, and from there it has become one of the largest, most ubiquitously known software companies in the world. Shawn, in the next hour or so, you'll be telling us the story of just how that happened, how the business is doing, what to make of AI disruption threats, and how to value this behemoth of a company that is still growing surprisingly fast.
Hey, Daniel, happy to be here and pitch Adobe today. I do think today's episode will be a timely one. Adobe is one of these tech juggernauts that has played a pivotal role in the overall market success in the last few years. Yet, as we'll talk about, the market has really soured on its business and is currently pricing them like it's going to completely fall off a cliff. And we just haven't seen that in the numbers yet. And a lot of that fear is because of all the uncertainty about AI and art creation, and also some real competitive threats from Canva and Figma. And I will be trying to make the case for why these fears are overblown, and if that is true, what that would mean for Adobe's valuation.
I looked at Adobe a while ago myself, and I just checked before the episode. The last time I looked at them was precisely a year ago. And back then, the price was already down about 30% from all-time highs. And even at that point, it still seemed a bit too expensive for my taste. And since then, it has declined another 25%. And honestly, despite being a bit too expensive, I didn't see another 25% decline coming. But before we get to all of that and the price action, the both of us love talking about company history. So how about you give us an introduction into how Adobe was founded?
We do love some company history, don't we? You kind of hinted at it already, but Adobe's origins are as humble as they come, you could probably say. And yet, at the same time, over roughly 40 years as a public company, this is a business that has delivered what is a mind-boggling return of 170,000% for anyone who has held that whole time. And it's probably a short list of people who have done that. But still, if you're keeping score at home, I've done the math, that's an average annualized return of more than 22% a year, which is also in line with the company's very, very high returns on invested capital historically. So those are some impressive numbers. And to take a step back, Adobe was founded by John Warnock and Charles Geschke in 1982. And the inspiration was really not all that creative, actually. It came from the creek that ran behind John Warnock's house called Adobe Creek, hence the name Adobe for their young company that they were building. And most listeners probably don't remember what personal computers were like in the 80s. And I certainly don't. I wasn't alive back then for that matter. But just to paint the scene, PCs were becoming increasingly powerful and more common at the time. Yet nothing in the content space was standardized. So what that means is you might have digital documents, but they weren't always uniform in their formatting. And that could just be really difficult to work with. If you created a document on one system, it might be completely different when viewed on another computer or when printed. And that is just a really difficult way to conduct business. And given that printers were still heavily relied upon at this time, those formatting inconsistencies would translate into printing difficulties. And there was a real need for a new technology that could enable computers to more effectively communicate with printers. So the physical version of a document actually resembled the digital file you were working with, which today sounds like a crazy problem to have, but you can certainly imagine how that was a really thorny issue back in the day. And after having worked at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, Warnock and Geschke understood this issue as well as anyone. And during that time, they developed Interpress, which was this new system for computers to communicate with Xerox's laser printers by converting descriptions of text and graphics and documents into what was actually an understandable set of instructions for printers to use in physically manifesting those documents. And Warnock and Geschke had found a solution to the shortcomings of digital printing and publishing, and yet Adobe was born out of their frustration with Xerox's inability to actually commercialize the technology they had created in-house for Xerox. So they opted to go on their own, and their vision began to really further come to life as they developed this programming language called PostScript, which would ultimately complement Adobe's launch.
It's always fascinating to see that even those younger companies still have an interesting backstory. And just as every successful American company, they of course had to start in a garage somewhere, but they also all have these funny stories about how they get to their logos or how they get to their names. In our Nike episode, for example, we also talked about a company that came from humble beginnings, although not this little garage, but more of a Japanese store for shoes. And they had their iconic logo made for just $35 by some random college student. And from what I've heard, Adobe got an even cheaper deal on that. Their iconic A logo was designed by John Warnock's wife, who happened to be a graphic designer, right?
Yes, she was a designer, and she helped shape what Adobe would become in its early stages, and literally did that with this logo she created. And I don't know if she got any royalties for it, but I think she's been paid handsomely through her ownership of the stock over the years. But as you kind of have suggested, the Adobe logo is as iconic as any logo out there. I don't think it brings kind of warm and fuzzy nostalgic feelings that maybe Nike does for some people, but we've all seen it on PDFs and with Photoshop, and the Adobe logo is as recognizable as any out there.
It might not deliver the same pricing power, but you do recognize the logo and you immediately know, okay, this is an Adobe project. I also recognize that you mentioned it all started in Palo Alto, which has this famous research center that you've also mentioned, and that is responsible for innovations like the personal computer, Ethernet, and also laser printing. But to me personally, it's more connected to a person, and I would think you probably know what person I'm talking about. And I think he also played a role in Adobe's story. So maybe you could tell us a bit on that.
Yes, around that same time, to make a very long story short, they did happen to connect with none other than Steve Jobs, who was painfully aware of the issues with digital printing too, and how they were kind of at odds with his vision for Apple, basically to make computers as simple and user-friendly as possible. And Jobs quickly saw the potential of their standardized solution to helping computers communicate with printers. And so she bought a 20% stake in Adobe for $1 million after the company had only existed for a few months. And as part of the deal, Apple would agree to license Adobe software for some of its upcoming products. So you can imagine this is the breakthrough moment that legitimized Adobe very early on. And this moment would later be seen as the birth of the desktop publishing industry that would make professional grade publishing tools really available to anyone with a personal computer. And without Apple early on, Adobe may have never been able to gain traction the way that it did. And of course, the rest is history now, but also Apple benefited from Adobe too, clearly. Adobe software could, for example, enable Apple users to resize fonts and graphics without damaging a document's formatting or quality when printed. And that was a considerable advantage over competitors' products at the time.
I think it's safe to say that it has been a win-win for both companies. Personally, my first association with Adobe is still Photoshop, and I guess you will get to that, but Adobe has become so much more than just Photoshop by now. It's an entire ecosystem that offers a service for almost every part of the digital content creation process, going from design to photography, video editing, even marketing automation. And I'm just probably missing more than just a few of their applications here. And in hindsight, it feels like this is an intentional expansion and it's just natural to develop their product portfolio in such a way. But Was this actually a natural progression from the early days, or did Adobe pivot at some point into becoming this platform-like company?
Adobe IPO'd in 1986 at a pretty steep valuation of $95 million, given that the company only had $16 million in revenue. So it was as much of a beloved speculative bet gripping the market with its promises of growth as really any high-flying tech stock today. And a year later, Adobe was releasing just its second product known as Illustrator, meant to empower graphic designers with a program that would help automate and simplify some of their work processes, drawing inspiration from the challenges that, as we've talked about, John Warnock had seen through his wife, who worked as a graphic designer. And of course, that leads us to Adobe's most famous tool, Photoshop. And this was an idea that came from two brothers who pitched the idea of Photoshop to Apple originally, and Apple actually passed. But obviously, Adobe saw the opportunity to expand its influence over the desktop publishing field. And by 1989, Adobe was licensing Photoshop, and it quickly became the backbone of how designers, photographers, and publishers worked, especially after Adobe Photoshop was officially released for Mac computers in 1990. And that success led Adobe to acquire Photoshop in full 5 years later, giving them complete control of its development.
Adobe didn't create Photoshop then. Or I didn't know that. I thought it's an application that's coming from Adobe.
Yeah, it's become such a symbolic part of Adobe's brand now. It is surprising to hear that it wasn't an in-house development. And I took some photo classes in high school, so I certainly got an appreciation for just how powerful it is. And I'm sure the early versions of it were even more groundbreaking to creative professionals. It's funny and also kind of fascinating that 36 years later, Macs remain a cult favorite among creative types, and many of those same people religiously use Photoshop still. I don't know how many other hardware and software product relationships you could say that for beyond, say, the Adobe suite of creative software products and Macs. And as sort of a litmus test for how mainstream something is, we've talked about companies and their product names becoming verbs, like with Airbnb and Uber. And the same is true with Photoshop. Anytime someone talks about editing a photo, they probably say, I'm going to Photoshop it.
Yeah, it's such a powerful thing. If the first thing that comes to your mind, if you just act on something, for example, editing a photo, it's just your application. And Adobe has this advantage in most of the applications it offers, not only Photoshop, even though not every one of those is a verb. One tool that you haven't mentioned yet concerns PDFs. And you've also talked about the PDFs and Adobe's history, but still there's a specific tool that's probably worth mentioning here. I currently have to file all sorts of documents for a dozen different government agencies because German bureaucracy is just a nightmare. And without Adobe, I think all of this would take me at least 10 times the amount of time. And perhaps I would still have to send them all the papers by mail.
I probably got distracted by some tangents here, but yes, thank you for the reminder that I should mention how PDFs came about. And in case you didn't know, PDF actually stands for Portable Document Format. And that's just a fun fact. But the PDF was a chance to solve a similar issue to what Adobe was originally created for. But instead of communicating between computers and printers, Adobe saw a chance in the 1990s to address compatibility issues with the exchanges of digital documents, since the layout or formatting of a document could be lost when sending it to someone else. So there was a distribution issue that they identified. Using Adobe's tools, though, people could create these beautiful documents and images, but sharing them with others was challenging if they didn't also have Adobe software downloaded. And John Warnock actually wrote a paper at the time sharing what was kind of a bold vision at the time for a universal document format that would address this problem, meaning that different fonts and images could be implemented directly in a self-contained file that was platform agnostic. It would be the same wherever you used it, a document that could be shared and used by anyone without losing its essential essence. And the real breakthrough moment was when Adobe unveiled Adobe Acrobat for free, trying to make its adoption as wide as possible. And by doing that, they built a network effect around document formatting, which they've obviously succeeded in doing. It is probably not a surprise that big companies and government agencies, as you said, were the first major adopters of Acrobat because they were in desperate need of streamlining all of their internal documents. And a few years later, as it still is, Adobe became the standard for digital documents. This dominance was even further cemented in 2008 when the Organization for Standardization, which is not something I'd ever otherwise previously heard of, recognized the PDF format as an open standard. And as an international standard, Adobe has continued to make its use and distribution available completely for free. So there's no business case per se around accessing PDFs, but Adobe makes the best tools for editing and handling PDFs. And that is where they make their money in the documents business. And I'm sure we'll talk about that more. But over the years, through these organic launches and acquisitions, Adobe's list of tools has grown longer and longer beyond just Photoshop and Acrobat. And Warnock and Greshke were a big part of the company's continued success, staying involved at least with the business until 2017 when they stepped down as co-chairman of the company's board.
One of the things I loved back then when I researched Adobe for the first time were their high quality earnings. They were stable, recurring, and high margin. So exactly the type of quality earnings that you want to see. Now, at least the stable and the recurring part is something that you could also say about a company like Netflix, for example. They have a business that is also highly scalable, it's recurring, it has stable revenues. But when you look at their early business model, you basically have a movie rental business with very few of those great characteristics. Now, has Adobe always had that great business model, or kind of did it develop over time, just like their product portfolio developed over time as well?
I think you could say Adobe went from a good company and even a pretty good company to a great company in 2013, which is a year I choose very intentionally because that is when they switched from offering one-time licenses for their products to a recurring subscription model, as you described. And that recurring subscription model is something that people call software as a service or just SaaS. And even though a number of Adobe products have become industry standards, they weren't really being bundled together at all. Meaning you might buy each Adobe service, whether that be Photoshop or Illustrator or Acrobat, separately. And so a few years earlier, they had followed Microsoft's lead in trying to bundle products together to create the Adobe Creative Suite, similar to the Microsoft Office suite of productivity tools anchored by Word and Excel. And the genius of this, besides just making the sales process more convenient and simplified, was that Adobe could bundle together some of its less popular services with products like Photoshop, and then that would accelerate their adoption. And that was a real, true competitive advantage and allowed Adobe to use its success in existing areas to drive expansion into new digital content niches. And that was when Adobe was a good business. And then, as I mentioned, the business model changed even more fundamentally when they shifted to subscriptions. As part of that, Adobe rebranded the Creative Suite bundle to what they now call their Creative Cloud. And that really ultimately freed them from the 12 to 18 month product cycle. Instead of trying to launch, market, and sell a new product every year or so, you're basically just updating the application that people already have, which is much more cost effective, as you can imagine, for the company, and also just simpler for users. The other thing here is that you ensure that people will pay a recurring fee to you every year, rather than maybe skipping a year or two between software releases. And you don't have to sell them on purchasing the latest software release with these sweeping changes. And all of that combines together just to make for a better business, I think for fairly obvious reasons. And by selling these renewable subscriptions, Adobe could offer them at lower prices rather than selling entire packages of software at a large upfront cost in exchange for indefinite access to it. So similar to how you just pay to access Microsoft Word now instead of buying Microsoft Word 2025, it's kind of the same for Adobe products for the most part. You're paying a fee, $10, $20, $30 a month instead of buying to permanently download an entire year's software package, which some people might remember that is how it used to work. And overall, I'd say the move to subscriptions was just a win-win in so many different ways for customers and for the company, because it made the whole process of purchasing this productivity software just simpler and more accessible.
I think Adobe was one of the early adopters in the software as a service business, at least among the larger companies. I'm sure there were smaller ones who had this model before. And what seems like a no-brainer today wasn't so easy back then. It was a huge decision because in the beginning, you take a huge hit to growth. instead of having these huge upfront payments, you now get payments little by little, and customers have the option to cancel as well. So all the infrastructure investments that you have to do without having these huge upfront payments, they kind of pressure margins. And if I remember correctly, it took Adobe a couple of years to reach the old levels of profitability and revenue again. And honestly, because you mentioned it from a consumer perspective, I'm not even sure if it's a win-win for consumers, because I know that I didn't like the change. For example, with Word or Excel, as a loyal user, you were now forced to pay monthly for what you previously owned for a lifetime. So sure, the product is getting better and better because they keep focus on upgrading it, but the lifetime price of the product is also significantly higher for the consumer. From a company perspective, I totally understand it because it's such a phenomenal business model. You're going from being reliant on each new product and there's high uncertainty in your earnings and cash flows to a much more stable and predictable business. And that helps, for example, if you try to plan out investments. Adobe now can know exactly how much money they have for research and development costs. And at the same time, they also have to invest a lot less because that's not so much pressure to develop this new huge product that could drive sales again. And then you can just stick to improve what works, which in Adobe's case is, for example, Photoshop. You can bundle all these products together and then you have a lot of sales and one product that's basically the main driver. We just recently talked about the late adopter to that game, which has been Nintendo. And like I said, they're 10, 12 years later, but they try to do the same, where they have this cyclical model where every new console has to be a hit. And now they're going to this subscription model to flatten out this cyclical nature. And Adobe, they did it like 12 years ago. So their CEO definitely had great vision.
Hey guys, this is your host, Shawn O'Malley. When I first started learning about stock investing, I had no idea what direction to go in. There's just so much to try and wrap your head around, but it's never too late to get smarter about stock investing from the ground up. After spending years interviewing and studying from the world's best stock investors as a company, we've distilled those learnings into a simple course for you. Why? So we can help you master the principles of excellent lifelong stock investing. The course is great for both beginners and pros. From studying what the legends actually do to small, practical ways you can build wealth more effectively over a lifetime. We'll take you through different sections covering the basics of what a stock actually is and how stock markets work, to strategies to optimize your retirement savings, picking great companies, what to look for in ETFs, how much you should invest, and how to monitor your investments, plus so much more. By the time you're done, you'll be ready to invest in the stock market, learning plenty of tricks from the pros along the way. To access the course and begin learning how to invest like the legends, just visit theinvestorspodcast.com/get-started-with-stocks. And for a limited time, you can use code STOCKS15 for a 15% discount at checkout. That's STOCKS15 when checking out. Want to land a job in investment banking or private equity, but feel like you're stuck on the outside looking in? That's where CFI, the Corporate Finance Institute, comes in. CFI is the #1 rated online finance and banking training provider, chosen by over 2 million professionals worldwide. CFI's courses equip you with the same skills top analysts and associates use at leading firms. I really appreciate that you can study at your own pace and have the chance to solve real-world problems with case studies. It gets even better though. Right now you can get 30% off any Corporate Finance Institute plan. Take the first step toward your dream job. Head to corporatefinanceinstitute.com, enroll today, and use code INVESTORS30 at checkout for 30% off. Look, I'm the type of person who is always trying to find new ways to make a little extra money. In this economy, that's just what you have to do. But not every side hustle is equally simple. Fortunately, using your house as an Airbnb is easier than ever, now that Airbnb has made it possible to have a co-host do all the hosting for you. You provide the space, get paid, they handle everything else. With Airbnb's co-host network, you can seamlessly hire a sophisticated co-host in your area to take care of your home and guests. I have a good friend who owns his home, but he's looking into law school, meaning he might have to move somewhere else for a few years to do so. Unless he wants to sell his house, his home would just be a liability that costs him money while he's not even there to use it. He would be the perfect candidate for working with a co-host through Airbnb to help him make some extra income from his place without all the stress. If you have a second home, travel often, or are away for extended periods of time, go find a co-host at airbnb.com/host and start earning extra money today. Those are all great points. And like you said, there were some growing pains and probably not every customer loved the change, but it has been objectively over the last decade a huge success for Adobe. And it has pretty dramatically pivoted its business mix away from these one-off product sales to that more recurring subscription model, as you described. And while the company did experience a significant drop-off in earnings for the first 2 years after the transition, I think we both agree that it was more than worth it. And by 2016, Adobe's overall profit levels had already recovered and surpassed 2012's earnings before they went all in on subscriptions. But you can imagine that period from 2012 to 2016, that was painful. There was a lot of doubt about whether it was the right decision. And one of the less obvious benefits of switching to this SaaS model has been significantly reducing rates of piracy and illegal downloads of Adobe software, because you can't just permanently download and own Photoshop anymore, for example. You're paying for an annual or monthly license that, once it expires, revokes access, and the cost to access a subscription is now just much lower than the upfront cost of buying an entire software package, even if over a lifetime it does end up being more expensive. So that reduction in costs and changes to how licenses are accessed makes the economics of piracy not worthwhile. And without going too far down the rabbit hole there, I'll just add that piracy is not totally free. You might be paying to run your own server or use a VPN. And after going through all that trouble, it might just feel silly because you might as well just pay $10 a month or whatever it is to access some subscription-based tool. So you'll have to take my word maybe on the benefits of how this has helped address piracy. And then maybe I'll just take a step back quickly and paint some color on the very wide range of products that Adobe has built out over the years, focused on digital media. And those tools might be around designing and editing content with Adobe Acrobat or their generative AI tool, Firefly. And then there's also the digital experience segment, which provides tools for marketing and analytics to companies with online businesses. And then there's also this much smaller and declining publishing and advertising segment that sort of offers services for building and testing ad creatives and streamlines content production for advertisers. And across those different areas, the business in total has generated over $21 billion in revenue last year, with 95% of those sales coming from subscriptions. That is, in other words, very high quality recurring revenue coming from a mix of large enterprises, independent design professionals, small businesses, and hobbyists. So not only is it very high quality and recurring, but it's also diversified.
Absolutely. It sounds like the dream of every company, to be honest. And they not only have recurring revenues, we also have a recurring theme of our episodes, which is the democratization of industries. And we mostly talk about that when we mention companies like Spotify, Uber, or Airbnb, but I also tried to sneak it in the Nike episode where I mentioned the retailers. Now, for Spotify, Uber, or Airbnb, those are all companies that pushed for democratization because they were the beneficiaries of that movement. You might say that's a bit different for Adobe, but my first instinct would be that Adobe is threatened by that movement. Of course, I primarily think about AI when I say this, but even before that, there were many small companies that offered similar but cheaper services. And of course, they were not as powerful, but they targeted a different customer. So as someone who has created some dozen graphics as well, although every graphic designer would take a laugh if he actually sees them, I like to use Canva for those graphics. For me, the offering was good because it was more intuitive, it was a lot cheaper, and they also have their own AI tools. If you combine all this topic, like the smaller competition and AI, how do you see that affecting Adobe 5 years out from now?
I'm sure we'll get into a lot more into how AI tools are impacting Adobe, but even before AI, there was definitely this trend toward professional grade design tools becoming available to hobbyist designers and individuals. So this is a trend that's bigger than the recent hype about AI. And the learning curve around design is just compressing, and graphic design is becoming more accessible to anyone. Yet, if you are a professional photographer or work at a film production company, you still need the most powerful cutting edge tools out there. And I think that doesn't include someone like yourself who's making graphics, Daniel, unfortunately. But that's where Adobe continues to dominate. Beyond that, you want a streamlined ecosystem for your workflow where you can work across different apps and basically do your entire job through a set of these connected services. And it's similar to how Apple's ecosystem is really convenient, where your computer works with your watch, which works with your phone and headphones and iPad. And Adobe's ecosystem of design apps are interoperable in that same way. as I've heard it described by management, at least with Adobe, the hope is going forward, designers can go from making a 2D black and white sketch in one tool to turning that into a hyper-realistic image, to then turning that into a 3D model, which can then be used to build a video. And then maybe using generative AI, you could turn that video into a metaverse type digital world. So you can go from 2D sketch to metaverse through Adobe. With the point being, across Adobe's suite of tools, creative professionals can design creative assets throughout the entire lifecycle. And to me, that seems like a compelling value proposition. Again, not only are the tools like Photoshop or After Effects individually powerful, but syncing them up and making them work across platforms more simplified has only made Adobe's offerings more attractive in recent years. Yes, you probably don't need Photoshop to make viral TikToks or Twitter graphics, but I'm sure the designers at HBO rely on Adobe tools as heavily as ever. So as design tools have become more accessible, there's been this proliferation of content creation. So there's a bigger and bigger pie, and more of that content is being created in fairly sophisticated ways, but that hasn't necessarily come at Adobe's expense. Like I said, it's a bigger pie of content creation, and some of it's being carved out at the low end through Canva, but I haven't seen any noticeable interruptions in Adobe's business at the top and bottom line because of it.
That's an interesting point because I'm fully aware I'm on the lower end, but at the same time, I would have still thought that at the high end, so for like professional film or movie studios, they would have their own individually tailored tools, so more specialized than Adobe. But I came to find out that Adobe is actually a pretty big player in that space, and a lot of Hollywood studios use their tools as well. So that's a very interesting point because I didn't see them as being part of their main customers a couple of years ago.
I kind of think of it like Google search relative to ChatGPT. ChatGPT has spurred more people to search for a wider variety of questions more frequently, but Google search remains a large and fast-growing business at the same time. So rather than taking business from Google, AI has made the search pie bigger in some ways. Again, I think you could say the same has happened here with design, with Adobe. AI and Canva have enabled more people to make designs on their own, but as the barriers to design have been lowered, there's also just a lot more design and content creation occurring too. So that said, they've actually also unveiled their own set of tools meant to appeal to what you call the lower end of the market. And that is users who aren't necessarily professionals. And that is a set of tools called Adobe Express. And the idea is really a direct response to Canva, and it's meant to deliver professional design tools to everyday people, maybe small businesses, teachers, or social media creators, and give them the ability to create sophisticated graphics and videos in a simple way within the Adobe ecosystem, and hope that some amount of them will eventually upgrade to some of Adobe's more sophisticated offerings. So it's a lot of pre-designed templates and drag and drop tools in Adobe Express. And as I said, it really is Adobe's response to Canva, where they left this opening in the market and Canva filled that void. And now Adobe is trying to counter that.
Yeah, drag and drop tools is more my level of creative work. And by now, Adobe has, and you mentioned that, grown to over 100 tools. So an incredible amount. And you would guess that means they're now offering something for everybody who's looking. But there are still some niches where they either do not have a product, or at least there are products where Adobe's offering is just not as good as the competitor. And that's why they tried acquiring Figma back in 2022, and it was supposed to be a $20 billion deal. And since I was a Canva user, I didn't do too much with Figma, and I do know it's more powerful, but still, 20 billion just seemed like a lot to pay for Adobe. So what did you think of that deal, and well, what has become of it?
I actually never used Canva, but I have used Figma to create mock-ups of changes that I wanted to make to our company's website. So Figma was really helpful for someone without any programming skills, or really any design skills for that matter, to show visually how I'd like to manipulate things and what the functionality should be like for the actual programmers who would try to implement the request. And I'm sure there are tons of other use cases for Figma beyond that, but I quickly realized just how powerful of a tool it is for web or app design. It's not hugely surprising to me that Adobe wanted to acquire them, especially if it's seen as being much better than Adobe's own user interface development tool called Adobe XD. Now, do I think that Figma was worth $20 billion after using it initially? No, I did not. But from Adobe's perspective, you could say that this just wasn't about absorbing a single competitor, but really it was going to be their response to the shift toward cloud-based collaborative design, where you can work on a project in real time and others can access and see the changes you're making, like Google Docs for designing apps and websites. That's how I think of Figma. And like I said, $20 billion seems like a steep price to pay for that, but it doesn't matter anyway now because the acquisition was blocked by regulators who were worried that consolidating these two companies would materially hurt the competitiveness of the design software market. The fact that they were willing to pay so much for Figma kind of shows to me just how much Adobe really missed the boat here on these freemium, more collaborative design tools. And Figma and Canva have largely built their businesses by filling that blind spot. By the end of 2023, it was clear that regulators across several domains weren't happy with the proposed combination, and Adobe had to eat a $1 billion breakup fee that it paid to Figma for terminating the deal. So that was painful. Losing $1 billion for basically nothing is never great, but it was a roll of the dice, and evidently they thought the risk was worthwhile. They thought the deal would go through. And they even stopped working on Adobe XD in anticipation of joining forces with Figma. And once it became clear that that wouldn't happen, the cost for Adobe wasn't just the $1 billion. It was also that they had to basically abandon Adobe XD. So they clearly don't think that they can even compete with Figma. And if they can't buy Figma, then they'd rather just give up on Adobe XD altogether. And that's very telling as to why they're willing to pay such a premium price.
How would you say, though, is this now impacting Adobe's Creative Cloud? Because they were willing to pay $20 billion, and you yourself used Figma. I know a lot of people who do use it, and they're even semi-professional, and now they don't even do Adobe XD. So what does this mean for kind of their flagship product, Creative Cloud, if they do not have their own offering for that pretty big niche?
There are a lot of niches in design and digital content production. And so this was just one kind of specific area where Adobe clearly lost. But their Creative Cloud suite of software products remains objectively the industry standard, such that just about any album cover, movie, or even billboard graphic at one point was probably sitting in an Adobe app being edited in one way or another. Even this very podcast you're listening to gets edited through Adobe Audition. So again, the point remains that digital content in one way or another pretty much always passes through Adobe. And I had never realized that before, but I've spent dozens of hours editing these episodes in Adobe Audition. And I'm not entirely well-versed on the competitors, but I suspect there's a good reason our entire company has opted to continue using Adobe for audio and video editing over the years. And I might hesitate there for a second because at first I thought one of the new tools we're using to help with leaving feedback on videos called Frame.io was some new AI-based competitor, but it's actually a company Adobe owns too. So even when I think we're moving off Adobe, we still remain closely tied to Adobe products without me even necessarily realizing it in some cases. And in certain areas, it might even be fair to refer to Adobe's positioning as being monopolistic. In some cases, like Adobe Lightroom, which is a software for photo organizing and processing, you have some professional photographers that have exclusively used Lightroom for their entire careers, 20, 30 years. And part of the way Adobe has cultivated that loyalty has been through getting people to use their services at early ages by offering Adobe software for free to teachers and students in higher education, kind of getting the next generation of creative professionals hooked on Adobe tools.
Now that you mention it, I think I actually used Adobe quite a while ago. It was probably like 10 years ago because I was a student. And back then, you just had a very cheap offer to use Adobe. And it's kind of a genius idea to go where people don't even have the money to pay you anyway. And then you say, okay, you can use it for free. And 10 years from now, you're used to Adobe and you just don't want to switch anymore. And I had to think about our Hershey's episode and the Nestle reference that we did, which is like every company in the food space that you don't know is owned by Nestle. And in this case, it seems that every company that you don't know is owned by Adobe. So that's just an interesting thought that I had. But we've mentioned a couple of business segments now, a lot of products that Adobe offers. So just to sort of quickly recap, can you summarize again the different business units that actually make up Adobe?
As you said, we've talked in some detail about the Creative Cloud, and that makes up about 60% of revenues. And as the name implies, It targets creative professionals with tools like Photoshop and Lightroom, as well as Firefly, which is Adobe's new generative AI tool for creating and modifying visual content. And with Firefly, at least according to the company's Investor Day presentation in March, you can do things like turn a blue sky into a sunset with just a click of a button, for example, stuff like that. Then the remaining 40% of revenues is split between their Document Cloud business, which is primarily focused on manipulating PDFs through Acrobat, and then what they call the Experience Cloud, which you could describe as this suite of apps and services that cover the distribution phase of digital content and customer profiling. And through this combination of business units, Adobe is really a one-stop shop for the entire digital content workflow, from creation of an art graphic to editing to then the distribution of that graphic and an advertisement, and then the performance measurement of that advertisement, and then iteration where you're doing A/B testing of different versions, and so on. That all from start to finish, that's all occurring in Adobe. And with their Document Cloud business in particular, they can basically cater to an entire enterprise's digital needs. So the Document Cloud business led by Acrobat does nearly $4 billion a year in revenue. And the importance of having a file format that's usable on any screen is all the more relevant given the rise of mobile devices and tablets as more people work from home. And relatedly, a significant number of all documents created in Acrobat are visual documents for things like marketing content, sales pitches, and infographics, sort of blurring the line between their document businesses, which you might have previously seen as being separate from their suite of creative tools. And now they're increasingly incorporating design tools into Acrobat, catering to more traditional corporate clients that may not actually specialize in design, but want to create graphics for presentations. And that leads to the conversation of how to think about who Adobe's customers are and how they differ depending on whether they use the Document Cloud, the Experience Cloud, the Creative Cloud, or maybe all three, or some combination of two of those three. And across these three business units, the company has basically two buckets of customer segments that they refer to, which it breaks out as business professionals and consumers who primarily use Acrobat and maybe some limited creative tools. And then the second segment of customers are creative and marketing professionals who mostly use the Adobe Creative Cloud and perhaps the Experience Cloud for distributing content and then measuring how it performs.
The last time I looked into Adobe, I came from more of a valuation perspective, which is why I was very excited when you told me that you would pitch Adobe and give a deep dive into the company. And I was surprised by all the tools that Adobe owns that I didn't even know about, from Frame.io, which you just mentioned, to another one, which is called Behance. And it's like a social media or a networking platform for only creative professionals. I only know it from a friend who tried sharing his portfolio of work there to land some orders. It has even the Adobe logo, so there's iconic A on its website. So it's not a secret that Adobe owns it, but it still feels like Adobe owns a ton of companies that you don't even know about. And all that power combined just makes it an even better business. And still, with the blocked Figma deal, and you said it probably doesn't matter that much, but I would argue that all this upcoming competition is still feeding into Adobe's business. How do you see the competitive landscape shifting? And how important is it that Adobe can probably not as easily acquire other companies anymore?
We mentioned Figma a little bit already, and they're probably the biggest competitor, but you also have Canva, who we've also mentioned a bit, but there's also Final Cut Pro and Affinity Designer and probably dozens of other smaller and more specialized services in the creative world that I'll be the first to admit I'm not familiar with. I'm not a creative professional. I'm an investor. But what I do know is that none of them have the product ecosystem and ability to bundle services together like Adobe, at least among those design-focused companies. I will say in different ways, Adobe also competes with companies like Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, and even Google through its Experience Cloud that caters to marketing analytics as well as in document management. But still, having interoperability between 24 different programs that can all work together seamlessly is a real competitive advantage at the enterprise level, particularly for creative professionals. And Microsoft and Google, at least in the design world, cannot match that. And after all, design is the largest part of Adobe's businesses. I don't think it's just the Creative Cloud business that's really sticky though. With the Experience Cloud, in some cases, it can take companies several years to get completely onboarded with using Adobe's Experience Cloud offerings. And as such, it would be almost unimaginable to try and suddenly pivot toward something else. So the extent to which Adobe's offerings are ingrained into just corporate routines and infrastructure can make some of those earnings very durable, even if they don't always have as clear of a competitive advantage in the non-design services that they offer. So even if switching costs and barriers to entry have fallen in creative tools, as long as it makes sense for corporate customers to bundle creative tools with the Experience and Documents Cloud, I do think they're likely to continue relying on Adobe for both, simply because of inertia, but also maybe just because it's simpler. It just simplifies everything for them.
And if you take a look at the numbers, it just seems like Adobe is growing and growing. In the last 5 years, the return on invested capital has been north of 22%. At least that's what FinChat is telling me. The revenues are still up 11% year over year. So there's no sign of slower growth or kind of competition feeding into Adobe's business. They even introduced some new metrics in the last earnings report to deliver some more insight and tell investors, hey, our business is doing good. One of them is the subscription revenue for business professionals and consumers, which is a bit weird. They define it as revenue from the Document Cloud, then Acrobat and Adobe Express. And those grew 15% in the last quarter, and they represent about 28% of the total subscription revenue. That's interesting because those are the exact same customers that we are talking about if we talk about the threat of AI. So those are the customers that are probably the least ingrained in Adobe's ecosystem that wouldn't have to face these high switching costs that the enterprise customers would face. And they have also metrics for the enterprise customers, which are defined as all the revenue from the digital experience and most importantly, the Creative Cloud minus Acrobat, which is going into the semi-professional businessman. And then they grew about 10% in the last quarter. And that's a lot more revenue. It's about 72%, but it still just shows you that Adobe's business is stable and growing, and especially the part of the business where people seem to fear that AI is actually taking market share.
Definitely true. And maybe competition could limit some of Adobe's ability to raise prices for certain products. But at the same time, as we've talked about a little bit, Adobe has so much room to not only expand its offerings and bundle its services together that it just doesn't necessarily need to raise prices to increase its average revenue per user. It can instead just focus on getting existing users to use more and more Adobe programs, cross-selling existing users rather than pursuing new ones or relying on higher prices. And on that point, Adobe has more than 22,000 enterprise customers, and just 1,500 of them pay for 5 or more Adobe services. So there is seemingly a lot more room for continued cross-selling that can get existing customers using more Adobe offerings and just raise the business's ARPU. But at a high level, my impression is that Adobe's position remains pretty solid. And we might just consider Excel as an illustration of why, because I think both of us coming from the financial world are very familiar with Excel, so we can understand it, right? Excel is the industry standard for much of the work that gets done in the financial world. If someone designs a superior spreadsheet product with AI, the vast majority of customers will just wait a few months for Microsoft to incorporate those products into their platform, rather than jumping ship and converting every file they've ever made in Excel over the last decade to some new spreadsheet tool on a whim, right? We're just not that sensitive. I've heard about probably better spreadsheet products, and I know for at least you and I, we're still in Excel. Companies and individuals who have used Excel for 2 decades aren't going to jump ship that quickly from it because a new product is maybe 20% better. Something would have to be 10 times better to really drive massive churn in that way. And I really believe it's a similar dynamic, if not even more so, in the design world. You could compare Adobe to maybe the broader Microsoft Office suite. So not just for the Creative Cloud, but also for the documents business. Adobe has benefited from this considerable first mover advantage with Acrobat to an extent that there are essentially no legitimate alternatives to the PDF file format. It doesn't exist. And by any measure, Acrobat remains the gold standard of PDF editors too, which is of course natural because they are the ones who created PDFs. So it's just very difficult to imagine companies at scale abandoning Adobe's enterprise tools for editing PDFs with Acrobat, especially if they're bundled together with these other products and services that Adobe offers. And quite literally, in the course of researching this episode, I don't know about you, but I probably downloaded at least 5 or 6 PDFs. And just to clarify, because I think it could still be unclear, PDFs are free to download, but if you want to edit them, add signatures, make annotations, do password protected documents, or even use Adobe's AI assistant to summarize and actually ask questions about documents and have the AI chatbot answer things about them, or otherwise just manipulate PDFs as part of your workflow, then you're going to want to pay for a service like Acrobat Pro. And I keep comparing Adobe to these other big tech companies to make my points. And to continue with that, what I'm describing here is similar to how anyone can use Google Docs. But at the enterprise level, to streamline things for an entire company or team, or just to unlock more advanced tools and storage, you have to pay up. So there's a funnel where at the top, you try to have as many people as possible using your products, which Adobe has succeeded in the PDF world. And it's a different story with their design tools. And that is what Canva and Figma have filled a void in. But then there's a smaller set of users ultimately in that funnel who pay for more advanced options that end up supporting the entire business and actually subsidizing the free versions of what they're able to offer. And that's true for Alphabet with Google Docs. And it's also true with Adobe here.
I feel like we've talked about AI already 10 times, but we've only really dug deep into the competition arising from Canva and Figma, and we only talked about the short-term risks of AI and how they generally shape the industry. But how do you think about it more long-term? So whenever I see a photo or a video that other people assumably created with AI, I think, okay, that's it. If we can do that just using AI, we don't need Adobe anymore. And then I try to do it by myself, and the results are, they are mediocre at best. And probably I'm the problem, but still, today's tools cannot yet compete with what Adobe can do, and that's what you pointed out as well. You have this huge moat where even if they could, people would probably wait for Adobe to have something which is only 80% as good, but that's fine for them. But how do you see it more long term? In like 7 to 8 years? I don't think it's a problem in 2 years, but do you see tools, AI tools, or maybe Canva leveraging AI tools to create their own ecosystem, which is almost as good as Adobe's in maybe 6 to 7 years, which would be a problem because Adobe is probably an investment that you would like to own for the long term, right?
Yes, I would. And I guess I say it as kind of a joke, but I think there are a lot of people who just dislike the fact that Adobe has been at the top for so long and that their products are so hard to avoid using, which is great from an investor's perspective. But yeah, there's definitely a cohort of people who want to celebrate what they hope is the end of Adobe's dominance. And from what I can tell, at least, that's just wishful thinking. And it's entirely speculative. And we all see these image creation tools from companies like OpenAI, and they've gone viral, and it's really easy to think, okay, it's over for Adobe. But there is a big difference between more people being able to create art and even short films with broad AI tools. And it's another thing entirely to displace the tools that professionals use on a daily basis, which also sort of implies that people think Adobe doesn't have its own generative AI tools. And that is just not true. I'd argue that Adobe is considerably better positioned to monetize generative AI in creative work, not just create viral tools that people like to play around with, but actually commercially viable AI design tools. And that's because they can directly integrate AI tools into the software that creative professionals already use. They have this platform advantage that these other applications don't. So for example, you can create and edit images with ChatGPT, but there's 2 problems to doing that. The process is not efficient because it might require many prompts, and the end result is unlikely to look exactly like the one I would have imagined. And you can imagine that for professional designers creating designs for brands who probably have very exacting standards about even the shading of colors used in an ad, that is a problem. You can't just rely on ChatGPT to make a company's brand art come to life. You can ask ChatGPT to make a Coke ad, and it may do a pretty decent job. But again, there's a serious lack of precision because ChatGPT is ultimately a very generalized tool. And Adobe's management team actually argues that AI will lead to more content being generated, which will ultimately need more editing, which will actually lead to its products being used more as creators seek more precise tools. So you could almost think of AI as like a gateway drug to getting more people eventually hooked on Adobe. And companies like Coke and Toys R Us have famously used AI to make some ads. There was this Coke ad that played in the Super Bowl a few times, and there was a whole lot of hoopla about it. But when that happened, Adobe's Firefly AI product wasn't out yet. So I don't want to pretend like companies aren't using AI at all, but we've seen very few instances of it. And those instances happened before Adobe's response had come out yet.
I've also seen some of the Coke AI ads, and I know they're getting a lot of backlash about being clearly AI, but honestly, I don't get the fuss around it. I think it's a bit different culturally because the Super Bowl ads have such a high status, and that's why people just want to enjoy them. But in the end, to me, it's just an ad. So I don't like to watch ads anyway. When I see the Super Bowl ad, I just ask myself, what does this has to do with Coke, for example? Why are they doubling down on this AI trend? And I think that the backlash emphasizes that people prefer to see human interaction in things that are supposed to touch humans emotionally. That's the goal of every creative work. So perhaps it's also more of a short-term hype that you want to create those images and all of that with AI. But in the end, it turns out that people want it to be more human.
The argument for why AI isn't as much of a risk as you might think is that AI models have a good chance of being commoditized. And in some ways, they already have. In that case, Adobe will increasingly integrate third-party AI tech into its apps. And as a company with the largest distribution of creative products and decades of relationships with major companies who rely on its services and just an air of legitimacy that some of these other companies don't have, I think it can still win and is actually playing from a position of strength, assuming AI models become increasingly accessible. And from the perspective of large corporate customers, I'm sure they'd much rather have an all-in-one partner like Adobe than dozens of different one-off AI tools being used throughout the company, even if each individually standalone tool is maybe marginally better than what Adobe has. And rather than being concerned that AI is going to disrupt Adobe's business, I think the concern from the market weighing down its stock maybe more that Adobe is going to have to invest in AI, yet these new AI tools won't necessarily increase their pricing power at all. They'll be making these big investments just to maintain their current market and earnings power, but not necessarily to increase them. Still, the casual designer might use standalone AI products, but major corporate customers are likely to want more robust end-to-end solutions. And if the lone freelancer or small firm switches away from Adobe's Creative Cloud, they'll find themselves working in an industry that otherwise entirely runs on Adobe still and is still standardized around it, meaning they would probably ultimately just be complicating their workflow by trying to move off Adobe. It's like working in finance and trying to use Google Sheets when everybody else is using Excel. And on that point, Photoshop has been the industry standard for 40 years. And at any time, you could have probably convinced yourself that some new competitor or technology would upend Adobe's leadership. Right? Like, I don't want to sound like somebody who doesn't understand the innovator's dilemma and how companies can be disrupted, because that does happen. But I mean, in reality here, we're talking about a very long runway of dominance, and they've only continued to invest in making the service more powerful and just compounding their advantages, further entrenching Photoshop's position, for example, as the industry choice for image editing software. And I think people who warn of AI disruption to some extent are probably casual designers or people who have never purchased an Adobe product. And they're probably not necessarily reflective of, first of all, demand from enterprises, but even really Adobe's target customers. Adobe's enterprise products have only continued to grow. And so the picture is better for Adobe around its high-end services. I'll be the first to say it. But certainly at the lower end of the market, there is some room for disruption and some serious competition for casual design products that we've seen. Fortunately, the enterprise segment is a significantly larger chunk of Adobe sales than any sales they get from these individual casual designers.
And the enterprise segment is not only the most important for Adobe, it's also where there's a certain problem discussed a lot, and that is the widespread use of AI and the protection of intellectual property. So just as with all the other forms of information that AI tools, for example, ChatGPT, use to either train their models and then give you answers, there's a pretty big debate about the right of publishers and if they're actually being treated fairly. And in your Reddit episode, you mentioned a deal between Reddit, which was signed with, I think, was ChatGPT, to license their content to AI tools so that they get a bit of the profit from what would probably happen anyway and has happened in the past before. So OpenAI didn't have corporate customers. So for them, it doesn't really matter if there's a big legal framework or if there might be a copyright infringement. But for Adobe, that's very important because of all their enterprise customers. And it can get very expensive if they are getting sued for copyright infringement. With all those AI tools, and you mentioned that Adobe also has a lot of them integrated into their services by now, how have they navigated this concern? And is there maybe even a competitive advantage that they have and can use?
The really interesting thing that they've done that I think is a testament to management's foresight has been to build their AI tools in a way such that they're completely legal. And to me, this is one of the most compelling parts of the Adobe thesis and why AI is arguably an opportunity for them. There are no gray areas with property rights here with their products. They've paid to license all the data that their models are trained on. And as such, they can promise to content creators that they can use Adobe's generative AI tools without any fears of infringing on others' work. And that is, as you touched on, the big concern with generative AI, right? Professionals can't really take the technology seriously because there's a risk that if they use it, they can get in trouble for plagiarism or copyright infringement. All of that is still kind of being sorted out. But Adobe also doesn't train its models on users' creations either. So this really epitomizes the difference between casual creators who just want cheap AI tools to generate images for them and the more serious enterprise customers that Adobe caters to who want to ensure that they're not creating any legal liabilities for themselves by using AI, and also that their own work isn't being used to train AI models that will benefit their competitors. Adobe being able to offer 100% commercially safe AI tools just strikes me as a huge value add and a really serious distinguishing factor between them and these smaller competitors.
We've pointed out about a dozen times now that the both of us are not professionals when it comes to graphic design. But one of my favorite research methods is what you can call the scuttlebutt approach that's originally introduced by the famous investor Phil Fisher. And nowadays it's pretty famous. I think Buffett talked about it, Mahncke talked about it, and it's used by a lot of investors. And the idea basically is to gain insights into a company by questioning customers, employees, and just about everyone associated with the company. Now, as I said, the both of us, we're probably not the best people to ask because we're not creative professionals. But here at the Investors Podcast, we do have actual creative professionals. So did you take that chance and use the scuttlebutt approach by getting their view on Adobe and its products?
We're very fortunate to have a full support team of creative professionals who do our audio and video editing, update our website, design graphics and logos for us and all that kind of stuff. So it's only natural to talk to them about how they perceive Adobe and how they use it so we can better understand it. So that is, of course, anecdotal evidence, but I do think it is helpful in forming a well-rounded opinion on Adobe. And so I asked them all the same set of questions. Questions like, in terms of how you've used Adobe and your understanding of how others you've worked with feel about Adobe products, would you say they're the gold standard for most creative work? Or do you think generative AI and other AI-based tools make Adobe less worthwhile to pay for? And one of our colleagues here at the Investors Podcast Network told me that, quote, in the creative field, there is an expectation that professionals are proficient in Adobe programs. Throughout my entire career, Adobe has been the primary tool I've used. And during my college courses, we primarily trained in Adobe software. It's deeply ingrained in the industry. She also said it would take a lot of getting used to for our company to switch away from Adobe, and that Adobe's bundling of tools helps justify the expense typically. And in her experience, she told me that she still believes it's worth paying for Adobe, as there's a certain convenience in not having to visit another site or use different tools since Adobe has everything built in. And most of her use of AI through Adobe has been with Photoshop's generative expand tool, which is apparently incredibly useful. And the way it works, as she explained it to me, is that if an image is cropped, the AI can generate additional background or extend a portrait from a headshot to a full torso. And you can also ask AI to generate objects, such as maybe replacing a tree with a lamppost. And just the feedback I got from her and some of our other colleagues was in that same vein, reiterating how Adobe is so essential and how it's the industry standard, how hard it would be to imagine switching from it, how competitors like Canva are nice, basic alternatives, but also not serious competitors, and how powerful these new AI features are. And when you overlay that kind of real world feedback with the financial results for Adobe, to me, it paints a very exciting picture for investing in the company, especially at relatively beaten down prices shares are down well over 20% in the last year.
I think you mentioned already the two most essential advantages for Adobe regarding AI. The first is that customers can be sure about the legal use of Adobe's AI creations. The second is that the ecosystem is so powerful that customers will wait for Adobe to adopt anything new instead of just initially switching and all the costs that involved in that. One thing that I would also add is the more personal thing. So it's a bit subjective and perhaps some people disagree, but we've talked about it with the Coke ad. For me, there's just something personal about a human touch in all of these creative things. And studies have shown that most people don't want AI pictures or AI videos, or even worse, AI music. I think we've seen something similar with NFTs just a couple of years ago, where all of the new art had to be an NFT. And honestly, I don't think anybody really liked it. It's just that art and creativity are deeply human, and the willingness to pay also seems to be higher for creative products which are made by humans rather than AI, at least in the long run. There's always the option for a short hype, but in the long run, I think that's what people would actually want. Having said that, when I look at Adobe's stock chart, I see a company that is flat over a 5-year period now. So investors are definitely worried about something. And the AI topic is now widely discussed, and it's also known. So if we would have to look for other arguments that Adobe bears come up with, what are the main ones and what do you think about them?
Well, beyond the whole AI thing and how that could lead to a paradigm shift in content creation or force Adobe to spend just a ton of money on these AI-based tools that might not necessarily increase its pricing power or the number of services it can sell, you could argue that momentum is maybe slowing in the Creative Cloud business after a few years of elevated growth following the transition to a subscription model. So there is that kind of slowdown that's maybe starting to be priced in. So Adobe's most dominant business unit is going to see growth continue to slow, or at least that's what a bear would tell you. And then the digital experience segment, that this is an area that Adobe isn't nearly as dominant and faces some tough competition from these other big tech companies who have their own data analytic offerings that they can bundle with other services. And just to paint some more color on the digital experience segment, this has primarily been built out through large acquisitions like the deals Adobe made to buy Magento and Marketo in 2018 at a combined price of $6.5 billion. But it's hard not to overpay when making these massive acquisitions, and even harder to fully integrate two different companies into your own business. And you could argue that Adobe has shown that, especially outside its core Creative Cloud business, it needs to grow by buying competitors. And that's just an expensive and potentially unsustainable game for trying to improve your business or expand market share in economical ways. If they were to struggle to integrate these companies or other acquisitions as hoped, or realize they overpaid for them, then they'd have to make write-downs that could materially hurt earnings for years to come. So the Experience Cloud is in some ways the weak link at Adobe in terms of competitive moats. With the document business and Creative Cloud, I think Adobe's moats are probably as wide as any business out there, but its advantages in digital experiences are just much narrower. I do think Adobe has had and does still have some powerful moats, from network effects to first mover advantages, economies of scale, brand awareness, and other factors working in its favor. But those moats don't guarantee success either. Moats can erode away, either slowly or quickly in some cases. And I can't argue in good conscience that there isn't a high degree of uncertainty around Adobe's business going forward. I do think its moats will protect them from a lot of pain in the short term, but over 5 or 10 years, there is no guarantee that the business will significantly grow or won't become much less profitable. And that's the risk we take as stock investors. And those downside fears are obviously what the bears are very tuned into with Adobe here.
But you mentioned it. I mean, that uncertainty is part of every investment decision. We would all like to have this safe and sound investment where there's no uncertainty involved. But if you have those companies, you pay the price for it. And with Adobe, you have what's arguably a pretty cheap valuation. And that comes with some uncertainty and perhaps some risks. And I think we've already done a pretty good job at showing if the data is actually supporting the fear that the market has, or if it seems to be a bit overblown. And that's where we have to think in probabilities and from a perspective of risk and reward. And how this will actually look for Adobe is something that you will tell us later on in the evaluation section. But perhaps there's some more threats that you want to talk about before we get to that. If so, that's the time to do it now.
One of the clearest threats to Adobe, we should maybe pull the thread on further, is the proliferation of this low cost and free design platforms that cater to non-professionals and casual creators. I know I've maybe felt dismissive of it throughout this episode, but it is worth understanding better. Obviously, I'm looking at Canva in particular here, which is an online design tool that provides templates for social media graphics, presentations, posters, and has that really easy drag and drop interface that we've mentioned. And Canva's growth has honestly been explosive. As of 2023, it reported 180 million users worldwide with over 16 million paying subscribers. And that demonstrates huge demand amongst users who value simplicity and low cost above everything else. The risk for Adobe is that a whole generation of individuals and small businesses may never enter the Adobe ecosystem and instead find that Canva is just good enough for their needs. Canva uses a freemium model, and that undercuts Adobe's pricing for those who don't require the full power of Adobe's Creative Cloud. It's just too much. The bundling is great for enterprises, but at the individual and small business level, it's just too much that people don't want to pay for. And just to look at the bear case a bit more here, they would argue that as AI design tools mature, businesses and individuals might just rely less and less on these professional software and may not even ever have the skills to use professional software like Photoshop. So instead of hiring a Photoshop expert to create a marketing image, a small business owner might just simply describe what they need to an AI and get a pretty usable result that is good enough. And that democratization threatens Adobe by potentially reducing demand for high-end tools among certain customer segments. We haven't seen it yet, but you could imagine that this is a real wedge in the flywheel that has been spinning for Adobe for a number of years now. And maybe to put it differently, if good enough AI-generated content becomes widely acceptable, the need for an expensive Creative Cloud subscription could diminish.
But that's all a lot of ifs, if we're being honest. And if we talk about Adobe's demise, that has been ongoing for years. But when I look at the numbers today, Adobe has compounded its revenue by nearly 14% a year since 2019 and 16% a year for net income. So there's been no issues growing the business up until now. And then with more than a 30% net income margin and a secure balance sheet, which I think has about 900 million in net cash, the company is very profitable and also financially sound. So it's hard to argue that there are any of these cracks visible in the business yet. And even when you account for stock-based compensation, Adobe's free cash flow margins are also well north of 30%. So now balancing the potential risks with these still very healthy fundamentals, what did you make of it valuation-wise?
You capture the picture pretty well there. And given the quality and resilience of Adobe's business, it has been surprising to see the extent to which the market has soured on the company. The numbers for Adobe are as good as any Mag 7 business, but for whatever reason, they're not lumped into that same category. The only thorny thing in their financials is the stock-based compensation, as you called out, which is significant, but also as a percentage of free cash flow. Adobe's stock-based comp is about 10 percentage points lower than Alphabet's, which notoriously has pretty high stock-based comp. So Adobe's is high, but not crazy relative to other big tech companies. It's about 20% of free cash flow. And I would prefer that it was 0, but that is not realistic in this industry. So when just roughly thinking about the valuation, I wanted to look at the free cash flow yield, which is like the concept of a dividend yield or earnings yield, except just with free cash flow instead of earnings or dividends. And basically, you're just taking the inverse of the price to free cash flow per share ratio. If a company trades at a price to free cash flow of 20, then you take the inverse and divide 1 by 20 to get a 5% free cash flow yield. And the point being, the higher the yield, the better, because it means you're getting more free cash flow per share when you purchase the stock. And with Adobe, as we mentioned, we want to make sure we adjust that calculation of free cash flow to account for the effects of stock-based compensation to kind of get a clear picture of the economic reality here and the company's true valuation. And after doing that, Adobe's adjusted free cash flow yield is roughly 4.5%, which is not bad at all. Alphabet's adjusted free cash flow yield, and I did go through and calculate it for these different big tech companies. For context, Alphabet's is a little more than half that, and Microsoft's is a little less than half that of Adobe's. So compared to both of them, despite having a similar set of industry-leading software services, a diversified business model, very high margins, a strong balance sheet, and recurring revenues, Adobe stock is valued considerably more cheaply than these peer companies like Microsoft and Alphabet, at least in free cash flow yield terms.
Something that I like to do is, and I know that's a rough estimate, it's like a rule of thumb, but it is to determine the expected total shareholder return by adding up the current free cash flow yield with the expected annual growth in free cash flow over, let's say, the next 5 years. So with Adobe, for example, you would take the 4.5% free cash flow yield that you currently have, and then you would add the 8 to 10% free cash flow growth per year, which wouldn't be unprecedented at all for them. And then assuming that most of that free cash flow is going to share repurchases, which is also common for Adobe, then you get a low to mid double-digit expected total shareholder return. And that's without super aggressive assumptions. It's pretty much in line with what management is telling you, and perhaps even slightly below that. And that's back of the envelope math, and it's pretty rough, but I guess you know where I'm coming from here.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, Adobe has historically put 3/4 of its free cash flows towards share repurchases, and even more so in recent years. And Adobe's management has said they expect double-digit growth annually in free cash flow going forward. So your rule of thumb here actually ends up working out pretty decently as a way to tell us that as long as Adobe can keep growing as expected without any wildly optimistic assumptions, and at least based on the current valuation, it is not a stretch at all to think that this company can deliver double-digit annual returns, which is my benchmark for an investment. And if I can plausibly expect as my base case a 12 to 15% annual return, I can still earn a satisfactory return in a bear case and much, much more in a really optimistic bull case, on top of the moats and qualitative advantages around Adobe's business, then man, that just starts to look like a really attractive risk return profile with Adobe. And on that point, the company is trading at its cheapest price to free cash flow multiple of the last decade, around the same levels as 2022, actually a bit below that now, during that time when tech stocks across the board were getting hammered. And there are also some signs from the company itself that they see the stock as being attractive too, given that the company has not only accelerated the timeline for its share buyback program to repurchase more shares sooner, but at the same time, insiders like the company's CFO, Dan Dern, have been making sizable open market purchases of the stock, which is almost always a good sign, right? The CFO, in theory, should know better than anyone what Adobe's intrinsic value is. And if he's buying, that gives me some reason for optimism. And just for reference, I like to read Morningstar research reports, and their equity research placed a fair value target of $590 per share on Adobe. And just for context, at the time of recording, Adobe's price is about $350 per share. And so they obviously see the company as being considerably undervalued. I'm not as bullish as them, but I get how they get to those numbers. And in part, that's based on the assumption that, as management has said, the company can continue to compound earnings at double-digit rates while R&D costs normalize in the coming years after rising recently to develop AI tools. Which is another way to say you're going to have top-line growth and you're going to have accelerated bottom-line growth as margins further improve for Adobe.
Morningstar is a great source, but I think they also have a price target for Nike of over $100. And we've seen that there's a debate about what Nike's is actually worth. And we debated for sure on that. So how does Morningstar's target and the rough math that we did around free cash flow yields corresponds with the price target that you got for Adobe using your own intrinsic value model?
I'll try not to bore people with the details of my model too much, but I always find these basic models as being helpful for thinking about the thesis. So for example, I just made basic estimates for how quickly I think Adobe can grow its 3 core businesses based largely on really just looking at their historical growth. And then I looked at things like how much of operating profit typically converts to free cash flow, net reductions and share counts from stock repurchases over time, trends and operating margins and all that stuff. And I get kind of a rough estimate of what I think Adobe's free cash flow per share can look like by 2029 in a base case. And from there, like I usually do, I try to use a range of exit multiples where I use these weighted values and then some kind of discount rate to get a ballpark number for the company's fair value. And then I tack on a 20% margin of safety to arrive at a price target of $390 per share as my base case. And if the company can converge on my estimate of fair value from that intrinsic value by price target, that would imply a return of 12 to 13% per year. And actually, from the current stock price, which is below my intrinsic value by price target, the expected return is actually closer to 15% a year. And to me, that's very solid, given the wide moat I believe Adobe has around its core business and its prospects for growth by upselling AI tools and bundling services together. And so if we can roughly get Adobe at anything below $395 per share, which it looks like we're going to have a chance to get it at a significant discount to that, then I would really like to add it to our intrinsic value portfolio and maybe at like a 5 to 7% weighting. As always, you can access our models and download them to use for yourself. And to do that, just make sure you subscribe to our intrinsic value newsletter. And we have the link to that in the show notes below. But that's just my thinking. Like I said, I'm underwriting a 15% annual return. I'm talking about 5% plus position sizes in Adobe. I've already personally invested in the company, so I'm bullish, but also biased. How do you see it, Daniel? Is Adobe a company, after everything we've talked about today, and after some of the research you've done previously, are they a name that you want to add to our portfolio? And if so, are you comfortable adding them in the same weight that I've proposed here?
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, I've researched it prior as well. So I don't know if I'm totally unbiased here, but I always said if you can get this company below $400, it's probably a great deal. And now we're way below $400. And I actually didn't start investing afterwards. I don't even know why. I just didn't get back to the company. But now you've made this great deep dive. I look at the numbers, and you know that I always have a bias for strong brands and businesses with moats who are selling at what we are thinking is a discount. And I think the moat of Adobe is pretty big. I think that, as you said, they have their own AI tools. So I don't see why there should be competition that is taking all that market share away from them. I don't personally see that. And at the prices it's currently selling, I'm kind of asking myself if we miss anything. Because if you're on the market, you always have to second guess your own opinion, especially if it's a lot different from the market. And the market definitely expects Adobe to get disrupted in some way or the other. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's other competition, but they are expecting Adobe's business model to deteriorate significantly. And you and me, we are thinking that fear is overblown. And we like to point, or what I often do is I point to Meta in 2022, where a lot of people said that business model is basically gone. And I know there's a lot of survivorship bias whenever you mention Meta, because it's a fantastic company, but it's also one out of 1,000, and 999 have probably gone bankrupt after that. Personally, I don't think Adobe is one of them. So at that price, I'm willing to have a position sizing of 5 to 7% because I think it's a great investment.
I like the way you said it. I think the Meta example is a great one. It was exactly where my head was going too, because just as the big tech company with the platform and the reach and everything we've talked about today with Adobe, of course, they're much more similar to Meta than many other businesses that have, had an advantage and then lost it. And I mean, if we can flash back to 2022, if people remember the narratives around Meta at that time, they seem absurd now, but people were saying Gen Z doesn't use Facebook. Facebook's not cool anymore. Instagram is getting its lunch eaten by TikTok. Apple has changed privacy rules that are going to ripple through and kill advertising on Facebook. And there was a fear that there was a recession coming that never manifested then. There was just all of these factors that were combining together. And I mean, at one point, at least from its peak, from trough to peak, I think Meta has been a six-bagger. And typically we have to recognize that a lot of things are priced in the market and that the market is typically pretty good at factoring in information. And so you really do have to think through seriously, okay, what am I understanding that is not being appreciated by the market? And what is the reason for it not being appreciated? And so it's really easy to either buy in completely to the efficient markets hypothesis or dismiss it. And in this case, this is just a great example of Meta as a multi-hundred billion, trillion-dollar plus company should be as efficient as any out there. And if Meta can be a six-bagger as recently as, from 2022, that just is a great example to me of what Warren Buffett talks about all the time with Mr. Market and how Mr. Market is not rational. And I think we saw that as we've talked about with Meta. There's a great example of how the market freaked out. It was wrong, and Meta ended up being a great business to continue to own. And a lot of all that stuff was just fluff and narrative. And my gut feeling is that a similar thing is happening with Adobe right now. That is not to promise Adobe will be a six-bagger. I mean, there are real risks here. There are a lot of companies that have succumbed to the innovator's dilemma. But if I had to bet, which is kind of what we're doing when we're talking about a 5% portfolio size, I want to think about Adobe as a long-term owner of the business. And as such, I think that they can weather this kind of current narrative storm where everyone has soured on Adobe. I'm guessing in 12 to 18 months, the market will have a very different view of the company.
And what gives me hope that we're not too far off with our assessment of Adobe is that there are clearly irrational reactions to Adobe's, for example, last earnings report. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Nike, and you just mentioned how Meta was supposed to lose its coolness. Gen Z doesn't use it anymore. Those are the exact same narratives that we talked about with Nike. But there's one important difference, because Nike's earnings, Nike's fundamentals, they actually deteriorate. So you need a turnaround. In this case, and also in Meta's case, you have a company that doesn't show any cracks. There is no big backlash. There is nothing that could indicate that the company is actually being in demise. So what we have is a growing company where you just think, okay, there might be something happening out 5 or 6 years, but it's not actually showing in the numbers. And when I talk about irrational behavior, the last earnings report that Adobe put out, they beat the revenue estimates, they beat EPS estimates, and they even kept their full year guidance, and the stock sold off 14%. I just don't think that's rational in any way. And if I see something like that, I feel reinforced in my assessment to say perhaps the market is not as efficient in this stock as it might be in others.
I agree. And actually, I used the tariff day mark that it was like a 3-day period where the stock market just was collapsed. You had it, the S&P was down like 12% or something ridiculous in a single day. And of course, that's a time that causes dislocation. So I use it as a chance to personally build my position in Adobe. And I invested a considerable amount of my portfolio, a couple percent into Adobe because I said, what do tariffs have to do with Adobe? I mean, of course, they would feel an economic slowdown, but it's like, this is a software company, a global software company. So tariffs have quite literally nothing to do with Adobe. And I'm sure, you could draw a map of different ways it'll affect them. And I'm not going to say that they wouldn't be hurt by it. But I think at the same time, we can both agree like, hey, if Adobe is falling 10 or 15% in a day on a tariff-induced market panic, this is probably not reflective of real changes in the business. And I think as investors, we can be really paranoid about always thinking about the future, right? Of course, when you buy an equity, it's all forward facing. You get the returns of how the business is going to do in the future, not how it's done previously. So we don't want to spend too much time on the history, but at the same time, we have to put our paranoia at ease a little bit and say, okay, Canva and Figma and ChatGPT have been around for years now. And where is the evidence in the financials that is damaging Adobe? Not to say that, Adobe couldn't have otherwise grown a bit faster, which I'm sure is true, but damaging them. It's not like Nike. And I know Nike is a position we hold, but I think we'd also both agree because it's our smallest position. It's not something we have our highest conviction in because we have seen the moats deteriorate and we have seen the business actually be affected. And with Adobe, there's just so much fear around how the business will be affected. And we just haven't seen it in the results. So I feel good. We'll talk about it more in the newsletter when we make our official update on how to weight the company in the portfolio. But right now we're thinking of probably at least a 5% position. So I think that's all I have on Adobe, Daniel. Maybe with that, why don't you give us your teaser for next week's pitch?
The first thing I can say is that I can assure you next week's pitch won't force you to listen to another attempt to find value in a challenging industry like some of the last pitches. It will actually be a high quality company with a ton of competitive advantages and perhaps even more than Adobe. And I don't think it's too hard to guess the company, which is where I won't give you 3 hints this time. Let me just say that it is a company that makes money when you spend it. And I know that's an obvious one, but it does so without you buying stuff from it or actually really being its customer. I think a lot of people actually have a hint now, will actually know now what company I'm talking about, but perhaps that's probably all I'm saying.
Okay. All right. I look forward to it, Daniel. For today's quote that we always like to end every episode on, I wanted to pull from the original king of creativity and design, Walt Disney. And he says, "You can dream, create, design, and build the most wonderful place in the world, but it requires people to make the dream a reality." For Adobe, it is their customers who use Adobe tools who make the world a little more wonderful. So that's a nice little thought there to wrap things up with Adobe. And we will see you again here next week. Reddit is often described as a hive mind. And if you can harvest that data at scale, you can get some very powerful real-time insights into the collective intelligence that is the internet. And as a result, there have been some studies that suggest that Reddit comments can be good indicators of sentiment around stocks, which I'm sure you might imagine is of interest to a bunch of hedge funds and stock traders. And as a result, Reddit recently announced that they're tapping into this demand for real-time data on what people across Reddit think about certain companies by partnering with Intercontinental Exchange to sell data captured from posts on financial subreddits like the infamous Wall Street Bets.